My name is Emre Güler. I'm a threat researcher at VMRay. And I work in the labs team. And usually the most fun part of it is when we get a new malware family that we can do a deep dive into, like do some kind of reverse engineering, sometimes a couple of weeks, and then try to figure out if there are any new techniques inside that we can use to have any kind of new detection. I'm sorry, I don't see my slides up on the big screen. Thank you very much. And when we do these kinds of in-depth analysis, we try to find out new techniques that we can blog about, tweet about, and of course have new kind of detection rules for our sandbox that we do at VMRay. And one specific focus of it is to find out if there are any new evasion techniques, right, that you should be aware of for the sandbox. And for Pikabot, there was one called indirect system calls, which was actually pretty exciting because it's pretty sophisticated. And that will be the main focus. But I will also go through all the other evasion techniques that we find there. So Pikabot is pretty new. The first sample has been seen somewhere around early 2023. And it's just the loader, basically. It's pretty small. And threat actors mainly use it to infect some kind of victim and then sell the access to other threat actors that will just download additional malware into it. One of the most well-known threat actors who've used Pikabot is TA577, who previously have used QBot or QBot. And for a period of time, they have switched to Pikabot, where Pikabot gained some kind of popularity in that. And they're also known for using the Blackbuster ransomware. And if you do some research into it, you will see they have actually used that ransomware to extract $100 million from their victims. So this is a threat actor who's making a lot of money. I mean, $100 million is a lot more than some of the defenders are doing, right? So this is an attacker with a lot of money. And so they could get access to some sophisticated techniques. So on the side of evasion techniques, there are a bunch of them I will highlight now, and then I will focus on the indirect system calls, which have worked on some systems that were actually protected by some kind of EDR or sandboxing, but the indirect system calls still evaded the monitoring solution that they had there. So it comes in two modules, basically, one the loader module and the core module. And the loader module is just to communicate with the C2, load additional data into it, execute it, etc. Some injection part of it. Pikabot itself went down with Operation Endgame. That was actually one of the botnets, one of the malware families that were targeted by it. But as we see that very often in malware families, that if there is a technique that works, it will be reused by other threat actors as well. It might be that Pikabot itself may come back. That is a bit more unlikely, but the technique of indirect system calls we already see in other malware families, so that will pretty much continue to be used. All right, so for the evasion techniques, there are a bunch of old ones, and then two specifically new ones. So one of the old ones is, of course, checking if there's at least one CPU or if there's more than 2 gigabytes to distinguish between a virtual environment where the sample is just being monitored and a real machine, right? And what we also see in more recent samples outside of Pikabot is that the check, which was usually like, is it 2 gigabytes or is it 4 gigabytes, have been extended to say, is it at least 8 gigabytes, which makes sense because you can't even buy a machine, I think, that only has 4 gigabytes of RAM, right? You won't even be able to run Google Chrome on it. So if you have like some kind of security solution where you can fake the RAM that is displayed on the system, remember to update it to at least 8 gigabytes so the workaround works for the evasion techniques. Another one, this is not a technical evasion technique, but more like a evasion technique on the level of evading law enforcement, is checking if the sample is running in any like Russian-speaking country, any country that were formerly part of the Soviet Union, basically. And the idea here is that if the malware authors themselves are Russian, or the malware is sold on a forum that is Russian-based, then they don't want to be caught by law enforcement, so just make it a bit more unlikely that they will be tracked down by them. But we also see this used in the opposite way. Like we've seen samples that are only specific to like German or Spanish-speaking victims. The one technique that is actually new, so sleep evasion, of course, it's an old technique, but Pikabot has actually used the beeping Windows API function to evade any kind of analysis that has like a timeout of, let's say, a couple of minutes. So usually you just do sleep for like 10 minutes, etc. But they found out there's a beeping function where you can give it a frequency and a duration. Now, we ourselves couldn't get the beeping API to work. Like none of the computers we used this on actually produced a beeping sound. So I'm not sure if this is just a legacy API. But Pikabot, at least in the earlier version, they used the duration to it as a sleep evasion. So that's also the reason when you do some research on it, Pikabot was called beep loader because of this evasion technique specifically. And the other ones are just watching the memory and see if some outside process is modifying the memory, installing hooks, etc. The other one is trying to load files that you know do not exist. And if the environment is telling you, yeah, they totally exist, then you know something fishy is going on. There might be some sandbox solution basically behind it, or some emulation. And the last one is hooking evasion via indirect system calls. Now, to get into it, to explain what indirect system calls are and why they actually had to go that far, I want to give a simple overview and then extend it with each technique and each defense to make it more clear. So, how do we get to indirect syscall? So let's pick a simple example of a sample that just creates a file, right? Usually you just call create file W or create file A. It goes to usually kernel 32, which just redirects to kernel base. It goes to kernel base, and kernel base is just doing a call to a native function, which is basically at the end just performing a syscall, which is a CPU instruction, telling the CPU, I want to switch from user space to the kernel space, and the Windows kernel will then execute the command that you wanted to have executed. So that is the basic overview. Now, if you historically go back to hooking-based EDRs, then what they've basically done is changing the first instruction of the function you want to call, let it jump into some kind of outside DLL or some kind of code that you've injected into it, monitor the API call, send it to a server, log it anywhere, and then continue the execution, and then it would go into the native function, which would go into the kernel. So that very basic form of hooking-based EDR, right? And one of the ways to circumvent this, to work around this from an attacker's point of view, from threat actor's point of view, is, for example, loading another copy of kernel base into memory, hoping that this one is not hooked. This is even as easy as just renaming the DLL, having it somewhere else and just loading it, etc. And that might work. Of course, you could also repatch the bytes back, etc. There are many methods to do this. Right? All right, so one way that threat actors then started to reacting to this kind of defense is basically saying, why can't I, just looking at the overview that we had here, jump directly into NTDLL? Like if kernel base is the one that is hooked, why can't I use the native function? Now, usually, at least on Windows, Microsoft doesn't want you to use any of the native functions, right? This is internal stuff that should only be used by their own programs because they are also subject to change. So they are not documented officially, but there are some unofficial documentations out there that people can use to figure out how to use these native functions in the hope that these are not hooked. And that will, of course, call a syscall and go to the kernel, etc. So this is using native functions. So for all of the techniques I show, I want to give you a small proof of concept to also highlight how easy that actually is once you understand the idea. So in this case, of course, just loading NTDLL, getting the address of NT-create file, figuring out what the function parameters are based on the unofficial documentation, and just calling it. All right, so when we look at the idea that I've highlighted now, just basically ignoring kernel base and just jumping right into NTDLL. Then the question is, can't we do the same with NTDLL as well? Can't we just jump over it and go directly into the kernel? And basically jumping over any hooks that might be in NTDLL as well. And that is the idea of direct syscalls. And the idea here is basically, what if we look into NTDLL? So we first looked into kernel-based, we've seen how it's implemented, how it's calling ntcreate file, and we've basically taken that implementation and put it in our sample. So for ntdll, but if we want to do the same, so what is actually implemented in ntcreate file, how can we copy it into our own sample so we can avoid calling into ntdll altogether? So if you look at it, it's actually really simple. I think it's about like 8 instructions, right? 2 move instructions, just to stack up to prepare some of the registers. The second instruction is setting EAX to 55. In this case, 55 is the syscall number of ntcreate file. So every command you want to execute from kernel space, it has an ID which Windows uses to differentiate between the function you want to call. In our Windows version that we tried this on, ntcreate file had 55. And I say in the version that we looked at because this ID actually can change between versions, right? Because again, Microsoft don't even want you to use any of this. And then there's a short check if this is a 32-bit machine, and in that case you can use an interrupt. Otherwise, if you're on 64-bit, you can use the syscall instruction. So for my proof of concept, I will ignore the 32-bit stuff and just simplify it more. But basically, if you just simplify it, it's the first 2 move instruction, the syscall instruction and the return instruction. That is everything that ntcreate file is actually doing. And the other native functions look really similar to that. So if you want to implement it in a proof of concept, this is how it looks like. I've written a wrapper function because I want the compiler and C to figure out how to prepare the stack and the registers for the functions. I didn't want to do it in inline assembly. But basically, if you look at the end, the 4 instructions are actually what ntcreate file was doing, just preparing the 2 registers, pushing 55 into EAX to say that we want to call ntcreate file, performing the syscall and returning. And that is all. And you can see this also in samples that just use direct syscalling. Now, so as an overview, what we've done is we've moved into EAX the ID of the ntcreate file, performed the syscall directly into the kernel, right? That is what direct syscalling is. Now, the problem here is that you can prepare, from the defender's point of view, you can prepare a callback function that will be called when a syscall is performed, and you can check, and that is the core idea, where the syscall is returning to, or where the syscall was coming from, right? The idea here is that in usual circumstances, the syscall would come from ntdll itself, right? You call into kernel base, it goes into ntdll, ntdll will perform the syscall. In direct syscall scenarios, from the threat actor's point of view, the syscall is coming from the sample directly, which should basically never happen because Microsoft doesn't want you to program that way, right? So you can really easily detect this kind of behavior and say, this is definitely malicious behavior. The sample shouldn't perform a syscall. And that is where the idea of indirect syscalls comes into play. So the malware developers basically had this idea of just trying to avoid performing the syscall in your own memory space. And instead, what they have done is jump pretty much directly into the syscall instruction in ntdll to avoid this kind of problem. So if there's any kind of hooking behind it, it's looking at where the syscall is coming from. It will look like it is coming from ntdll. So it doesn't look wrong. It doesn't look malicious. That is the basic idea of indirect syscalls. So for the implementation, if we just look at the ntcreate file in the debugger again, what we can do is basically find out where the syscall instruction is, what the offset is, and you can see that on some of the implementation that you can find on GitHub. They basically use the OX12 offset. It pretty much aligns across multiple Windows versions. You can, of course, extend this and scan the ntcreate file function until you find the syscall instruction, for example, right? In our case, we've just used the offset. So the proof of concept is actually pretty easy. So instead of using ntcreate file, which we've done before, you use ntcreate file, add the offset to it, and the 4 instructions below have just been adjusted to remove the syscall instruction and replace it with a jump to the syscall instruction in ntdll space. There's one more modification to it. It doesn't really have a name. We internally call it indirect random syscalls, and this is actually the stuff that Pikabot is doing. And that is based on the observation that if we only want to call the syscall instruction, we don't have to use the syscall instruction of ntcreate file. We can just basically, as highlighted here, just jump into the syscall instruction of any of the other native functions. and set the ID ourselves into our sample, right? And the idea here is to, again, to basically confuse the control flow and hope that maybe the EDR or whatever is behind it and logging it will get confused and say, oh, this call is coming from this function, map it to anti-create atom A, and then basically not even be aware that a file has been created. And the implementation is as simple as before. Instead of using anti-create file, we've just used anti-create atom A, or you can just pick one randomly. And the main idea, what you need to keep is moving 55 into AX, because that is what it identifies the function you want to call. While we were diving into this and trying to figure out how Pikabot was doing this, we actually figured out that most likely they were using the syswhispers2 project, which is on GitHub. It's an open source project. And the core logic of it is implemented in that tool, right? And if you actually look it up, there are multiple projects on GitHub that do like different indirect syscall-based evasion techniques. So that is where Pikabot basically ends. Again, it went down this operation endgame, but you can see that there are more techniques already available on GitHub, and it's just a matter of time until threat actors start using it. So I want to highlight two of them. One of them is already basically public on GitHub. Another one is our idea in the labs, where we want to come up with new techniques based on older techniques to prepare our sandbox that the evasion techniques will not even work. Like, be aware that what might happen in the future. So the first one is vectored exception handling in combination with syscalls. So this is an extension of the indirect syscall idea. So when you look at vectored exception handling, you have three properties that are really important for our use case in indirect system calls. First is you can register it, so you can tell Windows, if anything happens with my sample, if it's about to crash, please call this function. And then what it allows you to do is modify any of the registers, including the instruction pointer, which means you can change the control flow. And when we want to use this in indirect system call-based evasion techniques, what we do is picking the example from before. Instead of jumping directly into the syscall, in this case, we are jumping into an invalid address, or we want to like we have a null pointer exception or something like that, right? And it causes a deliberate exception, and the exception handler, again, allows us to directly modify the registers, and I have basically re-implemented the 4 instructions that we've seen before, the 2 move instruction, the syscall, and the return instruction. And the syscall is basically just setting the instruction pointer to the syscall instruction directly, which will perform the syscall. And the implementation, again, here the proof of concept is you just add a vectored exception handler, and then the rest is, the wrapper is pretty similar, right? We get the syscall address, and in the exception handler, you can see that the 3 instructions that I've highlighted, moving RCX to R10, which was our first instruction, setting ARX to the syscall number, which in our case is 55, and then jumping straight into the syscall address. All right, so the other idea is using return-oriented programming or ROP chains in combination with syscalls. So the idea here is that usually ROP chains are used in exploitation. You find a vulnerability in an application, and then you reuse parts of the application itself, the instructions itself, to chain them together to execute any kind of command. In the case of exploitation is, of course, like executing, spawning a shell or something like this. In our case, we just want to perform this call. So I prepare the stack with the gadgets. I call the first gadget, which jumps into the second gadget, which jumps into the third gadget, as an overview. So this is how it's supposed to work. So if you want to look a bit deeper into it, these are the 4 instructions again that we want to emulate with gadgets. And we found these 3 gadgets in NTDLL. And they are not exactly the same, but they are close enough. So the first one pops 3 values from the stack and pushes them into the registers, which we can use to move RCX to R10. The second one, instead of moving 55 into the registers, it just pops the value and writes this into ARX. So we can just push the value 55 into the stack. And the last gadget is just calling syscall and returning, right? And the stack is basically looking the same. So we push the 3 registers for the first gadget, we push the 55 for the second gadget, and the third gadget. And if you just execute this, perform a return on it, it will just iterate through the gadgets and perform a syscall for you. In the hope, again, that you will confuse some of the instruction flowing in any kind of monitoring. And we've used a reappeared tool on GitHub, which you can basically use to find any kind of gadgets, is that it has a cool feature called semantic search, where you can say, find any gadgets where EAX will equal 0, etc., and it will find different gadgets that accomplishes this. So the proof of concept of it, again, is pretty easy. So in our case, because we are not doing exploitation, we are executing the application ourselves, means we can actually search for any of the gadgets inside of the memory. We don't have to hard code any of the addresses we found earlier, so it should work across Windows version as long as the gadget is in there. And then we prepare the stack and then execute it, right? All right, so that was from the attacker side. So from the defender side, then the question is, how can we detect this and then say this is malicious behavior? How can we differentiate between any of the techniques I've showed earlier and legitimate usage? And what you can see is if you actually call create file W to create a file, you will see in the call stack it jumps into, or it calls into kernel base, and then another kernel base probably preparing some stuff, and then it goes into NTDLL. But in the case of indirect system calls, you basically have only the sample jumping into NTDLL. So you won't even see the NTDLL line in here because you're jumping into that space and you're not calling into it. So you could use this to differentiate between legitimate and illegitimate usage. And then again, the attacker side. And now this is the edge of basically what is happening in the research community where they are. And that is the idea of faking that call stack. Because if you have an EDR that is looking at the call stack to see if it's malicious, now attackers want to fake it. And there are basically 2 ideas. So the first idea is, again, going back to the vector exception handling in combination with hardware breakpoints, basically saying when the syscall is about to be executed, I will perform some kind of magic on the stack so it will look like it is coming from kernel base. And then when it's being returned, I will clean up the stack again. So from the syscall perspective, it will look all fine. And the other idea that we've developed here with the ROP chains is basically the same, but instead of pretending that it's just returning somewhere, you actually push some kind of return instruction addresses of kernel base into the stack, so that after the syscall, it will actually jump back into kernel base. And I've highlighted it here in the overview. It's basically what we have before, right? We prepare the stack, perform a return instruction, go into the gadgets, but afterwards we jump back into kernel base, which will just perform the return instruction. And for the syscall, it might look correct because it's jumping back into kernel base. So I want to conclude with 3 takeaways from this. First of all, what we always see is that, like, just looking at how much money threat actors are making, it is just expected that they will get their hands on more sophisticated technique. I mean, if you have $100 million, for example, that I've highlighted in the beginning, it's easier to get someone who may not be actually interested in being a criminal. If you give them enough money, you might find someone who can build some sophisticated techniques for you, right? So we will see more sophisticated techniques, and also this syscall-based idea, what we've seen is there are more and more samples using this. So at least in the last few weeks, we've found a sample actually that has 0 detection on virus total. It works, it's using indirect system calls, some kind of custom implementation. We couldn't see that it was implemented anywhere on GitHub, etc. And we think that this will be on the rise. Like, this was not even a known malware family, right? And the other one is, of course, now, in the end, I've shown you how to fake the call string and how to, on the defender side, detect it, etc. It's another cat and mouse game, right? The attackers will devise new techniques, and the defenders have to be able to differentiate between them both. And I think that will go on for indirect system calls as well. And with that, I thank you, and I'm open to any questions.